All right, let's get an understanding of how international law and these extradition agreements work. I'm joined now by constitutional law expert advocate Michael Osborne. Advocate, thank you very much for joining us. Do you agree that extraditions are, as a general rule, complex and tedious?
Good evening. I'm not sure about tedious, but certainly complex. And it's rendered complex because you're operating essentially on two different planes. Extradition at some level obviously is a domestic affair. The country from which extradition is requested needs to engage in a process to determine whether the extradition is allowable or consistent with the existing treaty relationship. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there's the international level, which is government to government, and essentially a political decision, ultimately, that has to be made by the requested country to hand over this person. So, yes, it is complicated and long-winded very often.
Talk to me about South Africa's agreement in terms of extradition with the UAE, which is a relatively recent deal, if I'm correct.
Yes, in 2018 an agreement was entered into, but it's only been ratified on the UAE side relatively recently. And the agreement looks very much as you would expect such an agreement to look like. It's quite similar to equivalent treaties with the US and Britain, for example. And it sets up this procedure where the requesting country has to put in an application properly documented with charge sheets, etc., etc. The requesting country then has to use its own internal procedure to process that application. And various substantive requirements are set up, much as with other extradition treaties that we're familiar with. There's a requirement, for example, that the offense for which extradition is sought must be an offense in both countries, both in South Africa and in Dubai. And that, for example, it carries at least 1 year imprisonment, also in both countries. There's also human rights restrictions, such as, for example, there cannot be extradition where the death penalty may be imposed in the other country.
So I wanted to ask you about the fact that the Guptas are actually Indian nationals. Does this put a further complication into it? And also we're hearing that they might be wanted in India on tax evasion. Could we have a situation where the Indian authorities say, no, we want them back? Or would South Africa get first preference? And I'm thinking particularly of the Michael Chang case. He's just been told, well, his case, his appeal, has just been dismissed by our constitutional court. The United States applied to South Africa to have him extradited. Michael Chang, of course, former finance minister of Mozambique, arrested in South Africa. Meanwhile, the Mozambique authorities said, no, 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 we want him back. This matter had to go to our constitutional court, which has now dismissed the appeal. He will, as far as I understand, be heading now to the USA. But it has complicated matters for years. Could the same sort of thing happen with the Guptas, do you think?
Yes, it could well arise. As I say, there are technical legal requirements set out in the treaty, but there's an overriding political discretion that's exercised in Dubai. And if Dubai, for reasons of foreign relations or traditional ties, decides to give priority to one request over another, there's nothing that South Africa can do about that. As for the Indian case, I'm not aware that there has been any formal request from India directed at Dubai. And you would think that all things being equal, although all things never are equal, there'd be a kind of a first come, first serve priority given.
So let's look at Shephard Bokhiri, the pastor who absconded from South Africa. One of his arguments against extradition is he believes there's a vendetta against him, that he won't be treated fairly in South Africa. If we think of Shirin Divani, who eventually did return to stand trial, he was arguing about the violence in South Africa. Could the Guptas raise similar concerns? Because let's face it, they're basically vilified here in South Africa. Could they, quite fairly in a way, saying we're going to come back to a situation that will not see us fairly treated?
I don't know if the argument would be fair, but certainly this is routinely the argument one would hear. And there's essentially two strands to the argument that you've just foreshadowed. The first is that the legal system in the requesting state is not such that due process would be afforded. And a country, it's provided for in this treaty, as it is in many other treaties, that an extradition is premised upon the assumption that if the person is extradited, they'll be fairly treated at the other end. The other strand is not so much to do with the quality of the justice system, but whether they will be physically safe should they be sent back. So yes, these are arguments that are routinely raised, and no doubt will be raised. I should say there's another complication, and that is, yes, no doubt the Guptas will be approaching the Dubai court. They could also be approaching a South African court in an effort to review and set aside the request directed at Dubai to extradite them. So you could well have two different challenges going on at both countries or in both countries simultaneously.
All right, so there's lots of hoops to jump through, so let's see how long it takes, and let's hope that our authorities are really tight with their processes to make this watertight. Thank you so much for telling us a little bit more. Really fascinating insights there from constitutional law expert Michael Osborne.